I'm doing something a little bit unusual today. Pete and I have talked in the past about doing sort of mini-sodes of the Liberty Starship program. The two of us are only able to meet one day a week on Monday, usually at 4 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, which is 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And a lot of times we kind of miss issues that are very topical, things that are kind of breaking news that are happening. Our last episode was actually really good. I encourage folks to take a look at it. We actually had the Arizona Republican Party secretary of the state Arizona State Republican Party, and we had her on the air. Her name is Cindy Love. She did a great job. Unfortunately, I didn't get to participate much in that because I was having all sorts of technical difficulties during that program. But I did get to hear most of it, and she did a great job. And I encourage people to check out that program. We did a lot of discussion about police reform, about Trump, about the election, about the civil unrest. I mean, it was just a freewheeling discussion where we hit all of those bases. And she was a wonderful guest. But there's some breaking news right now regarding Trump's executive order. And I'm very big about citing my sources and making sure that I let people know where I'm getting my information from. And in this particular case, it's right from the horse's mouth, so to speak. So this is the actual text of the executive order on safe policing for safe communities. This is the executive order that Trump recently issued, I think just hours ago. It was obviously issued today. The date is listed right on there of June 16, 2020. And I think it's important to go over some of the takeaways of this particular document. So I've read it. I've read the entire text of it. And I think it's widely reported, I think, as far as what the big takeaways are. But I thought it would be nice to actually go over the language used in the executive order to give a little more context to what we're really talking about here. So one of the big issues we have here is certification and credentialing. Okay, so this is the part that I think a lot of people are focusing on and should be focusing on, and this is probably the biggest part of the order. So it says state and local law enforcement agencies must constantly assess and improve their practices and policies to ensure transparent, safe, and accountable delivery of law enforcement services to their communities. Independent credentialing bodies can accelerate these assessments, enhance citizen confidence in law enforcement practices, and allow for the identification and correction of internal deficiencies before those deficiencies result in injury to the public or to law enforcement officers. The Attorney General shall, as appropriate and consistent with applicable law, allocate Department of Justice discretionary grant funding only to those state and local law enforcement agencies that have sought or are in the process of seeking appropriate credentials from a reputable, independent credentialing body certified by the Attorney General. So this is a key point. I haven't seen a lot of coverage of this, but this is really interesting. So what we're seeing here is, first of all, we're talking about the power of the purse. The first question I had when I heard about this, that Trump was going to use an executive order for police reform, the first question in my mind was, what authority does he have to do that? What can he actually, he can't order local police to do anything. There's actually a very well-established constitutional principle called the non-commandeering doctrine. Those of you that are either interested or have been following things going on with the whole sanctuary cities situation in California and other places, that's a key part of that debate, because the federal government cannot use state and local police or state and local agents of any kind to enforce federal laws. They can't do that. They can't force them to do that. State and local authorities can cooperate with federal investigators and federal law enforcement, but they cannot be compelled to enforce federal law unless they themselves have some sort of dual certification and are themselves federal officers. So that's a key point. So when I first heard about this, I was wondering, well, how exactly is Trump going to be able to accomplish anything? Because he cannot directly order, say, a state trooper or your local city police officer to do anything. He really can't. So what we're using here is the power of the purse. So this is similar to what they did years and years ago when they created the federal highway system. A great example of this is the 55 mile per hour, the standard of 55 miles per hour throughout the United States. The reason we got that standard was because the federal government would not give funding for highways unless states adopted that law. So this is a very similar situation. So that's the kind of precedent that we're looking at right now as far as what they're looking at doing to quote unquote reform police agencies. And in this case, what they're trying to say is that police agencies now are going to have to be looking at their certification process, and that their certification process, if they want any money from the federal government, is going to have to comply with federal standards. And I honestly don't know how I feel about this. This is, one of my own narrative has been that I believe a lot of what's going on is an attempt to create a national police force. And I see this as a very good first step in doing that. If you create a sort of national certification board, if you will, that is definitely a first step towards making a national police force. There's just no doubt in my mind. At the same time, the federal government does have a role in local law enforcement. I'm not trying to say that it doesn't. The federal government absolutely does have a role in local law enforcement, and that's based on both the 14th Amendment and the Fourth Amendment. Both of those provisions, basically because of the 14th Amendment, the Fourth Amendment applies and has been used in determining things like use of force and search and seizures and those kinds of things, those kinds of issues definitely can be adjudicated in the federal court system. In other words, state officials, local officials are subject to those provisions of the Constitution, again, because of the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment basically is the amendment that makes state officials subject to the Bill of Rights. Now, that's the general interpretation. I mean, that's the easiest interpretation, I think, of at least the first section of the 14th Amendment. There's actually a lot more there, but that's the relevant part, especially to law enforcement. So this is, again, I think one of the big questions has to be, who are these independent credentialing bodies? Who are they going to be? And I think that's a huge question because we don't know. At least I don't know. As far as I haven't heard anything official to be said what these bodies are. Are they multiple bodies? Is there just one that the Attorney General is going to recommend? These are supposed to be independent bodies, right? But how independent? I mean, what are we talking about here? Are these going to be agencies, or are they going to be private companies? For instance, there are private companies that do certifications of law enforcement agencies. They do audits and all sorts of stuff. Some of these companies are international in scope. In fact, you may have noticed, depending where you live, you may have noticed at different times, you'll see something on a police car and it'll say like accredited by blah, blah, blah. And there are numerous agencies that do accreditation of police agencies. And the ones that I know of are not government bodies. They are actually private companies. Many of them are international, especially the ones that are most popular, the ones that are, I guess, the ones that have been utilized the most, the ones that I'm aware of. They're actually international companies. So they actually do certifications not just in the United States, but in places like Canada and in other countries as well. So I'm kind of interested to really know, like they always say the devil is in the details. And this is a detail I would really like to know more about, which is who are these independent credentialing bodies? And what does it mean by independent? You know, how do we define independence? Are they going to be state? For instance, most states, or at least many states, have what's called POST. They have the Peace Officer Standards and Training Board. And POST is sort of a quasi-national standard in that POST exists in multiple states, but it exists at the state level. In other words, POST is sort of a standard of conduct, a standard of training for police that has been adopted as a sort of nationwide model. And various states have adopted this standard, but their POST boards remain independent in the sense that they are independent by each state. They are not basically governed by some national board that tells them what to do. They're governed by individual state laws. So I'm kind of curious how they if they intend to, like, if Post, for instance, would be considered meeting the standard or not. That's pretty interesting. So again, the devil is in the details, and we still don't know exactly what that means. Now, the other thing that everybody's talking about is this use of force. Now, again, they're using the power of the purse. So this is not, again, the president cannot order local law enforcement not to use chokeholds. He can't do that. That violates the non-commandeering doctrine. He cannot directly order state officials to do anything, really. He just can't, unless he uses some sort of other method, such as drafting them into the military, or he uses some of the old militia laws or something like that. He just can't. He can't order state officials to do things. So this is also related to the power of the purse. So what they're saying is that they will deny funding to police agencies if they don't do this. And what they're saying that they have to do is that the state or local law enforcement agencies' use of force policies have to prohibit the use of chokeholds, and they define chokeholds as a physical maneuver that restricts an individual's ability to breathe for purposes of incapacitation, except in those situations where the use of deadly force is allowed by law. Now, the agency that I used to work for already had this policy in place. They would not allow specifically, they didn't allow any chokeholds that were about inhibiting a person's ability to breathe. Okay, so some of you may be familiar with the carotid technique, which was a very popular technique, I think all the way through the mid-90s. It was actually, it kind of got out of use around that time. And it's still taught in a lot of police agencies, but usually as a deadly force option. So the thing about the carotid restraint is just as it's named, what you're doing is you're stopping the flow of blood with the carotid arteries on the neck. And this doesn't choke you necessarily in the sense that people think of choking, because when we think of choking, we think about impairing the windpipe. And that's the traditional choke, like the chicken choke or whatever you want to call it. So when you choke somebody, typically what a person does is they try to impair the airway. The carotid restraint is a blood choke that basically stops blood from going to the head. So I know there's some people that are already kind of going after this because they feel like this still allows for the carotid technique, while basically saying that officers can't use any kind of I guess, what would you call it, a poor man's choke. I don't know how else to describe it. The chicken choke, you know what I mean, where you just grab somebody by the throat. So, I don't know how I feel about that exactly. First of all, I want to say that when it comes to the carotid, I actually do think the carotid should be allowed in more circumstances than it is. I actually think the carotid may have been very useful in the situation with George Floyd. We'll never know. Okay, but because the carotid restraint done properly is, I think, a very good tool for dealing with aggressive individuals. And I'll take that back. In George Floyd's case, it wouldn't have been applicable because there was no active aggression that I saw in that video. So it wouldn't necessarily apply in that specific circumstance. But there are other circumstances where it absolutely could have applied, and it could have actually de-escalated the situation. Because once someone goes into active aggression, and that's when that can include pulling away, that can include trying to stand up when an officer's literally on top of them. There's all sorts of elements to active aggression that are not just necessarily you punching the officer or something like that, where a carotid restraint actually would be very helpful. I can think of the shooting that happened in Atlanta. If that officer had been able to, and he looked like he had the opportunity, if that officer had been able to use the carotid restraint, he probably would have been able to incapacitate that suspect, and he wouldn't have been able to get the taser and run off and all those other things. So personally, I think the carotid has use beyond deadly force. But as I mentioned, in the agency that I worked at, we didn't have that option. The carotid was deadly force, and I think most larger agencies have designated the carotid restraint as deadly force for a very long time. When it comes to the chicken choke, Okay, I think the chicken choke, for the most part, is an instinctive reaction. That's not something that's taught in any police academy that I'm aware of. Nobody teaches police officers to grab people, where they're putting pressure on their esophagus and putting pressure on the windpipe. That's not something that's taught. What happens is that's an instinctive reaction by a human being to defend themselves in a situation where someone is facing them and either approaching them or looks like they're going to attack them. They could even be spitting at them. It's an instinctive reaction. And it's not something where I think most officers, first of all, I don't think that there's much documentation to say that that's actually ever killed anybody or killed people in any kind of numbers that I'm aware of. That's not, we're usually talking about the carotid, actually, which is a completely different technique. We're usually talking about the carotid. But again, this is use of the power of the purse. This is, they're basically saying that if you allow for this technique in your use of force policy, you will be eliminated from grant funding and things like that. The last key piece of this executive order is about information sharing. So we basically have got this idea of a database. So it says the Attorney General shall create a database to coordinate the sharing of information between and among federal, state, local, tribal, and territorial law enforcement agencies concerning instances of excessive use of force related to law enforcement matters, accounting for applicable privacy and due process rights. It says the database described in this section shall include a mechanism to track, as permissible, terminations or decertifications of law enforcement officers, criminal convictions of law enforcement officers for on-duty conduct. I thought that was interesting that it specifically says on-duty conduct and not off-duty conduct. I thought that was interesting. And civil judgments against law enforcement officers for improper use of force. So we're looking at tracking terminations, decertifications, and criminal convictions for on-duty conduct, as well as civil judgments against law enforcement officers for improper use of force. I believe that would mean that other civil judgments against police officers would not be a base. It shall account for instances where a law enforcement officer resigns or retires while under active investigation. But this again says related to the use of force, which I actually like that. The Attorney General shall take appropriate steps to ensure that information in the database consists only of instances in which law enforcement officers were afforded fair process. And I like that too, because I think that's really important. One aspect of this entire debate that is being lost because there's just not a lot coming from the other side right now in terms of coverage by the media. Due process is a really important key to law enforcement reform and real reform. And I think a lot of the reform we're talking about is silly and fake reform. For instance, talk about the chokeholds. I don't know of any agency that authorizes a chicken choke. None of them do. That is not a permissible use of force. That's not something any of them train in. There are agencies that train in the carotid. The carotid is usually, in my experience, considered deadly force. And in my opinion, should actually be lower. I think it should be something you can use for active aggression because I think it's an effective way to immobilize and to take control of a suspect, particularly if they're bigger and stronger than you. And that's one thing that is completely lost in a lot of this debate as well, is that police officers are not Superman. But in this case with the database, I think that there's some pretty good things about it. I do think it's interesting. Like I said, it does kind of stand out to me that they say, for instance, that they're going to track only criminal convictions for on-duty conduct. So any off-duty conduct would not be included in this database. It would be treated differently. So that's kind of interesting to me. But I do think it's good that they talk about fair process, which I think they really mean due process. Although they are using different terminology, and you have to be careful about that, any kind of legal paperwork. And let's face it, executive orders they are de facto laws. They are not de jure laws because they are not actually enacted by a legislature, but they are de facto laws. So I do think the database is a good idea. It's an interesting thing. That's one way that the national government, I think, can absolutely be involved in this entire debate with police reform. But again, my concern has been and always will be that a lot of this is simply being done to create a national police force, and that will be a very, very bad thing, especially for liberty. Anyway, I'm going over 20 minutes, which is about the maximum that Pete and I have talked about as far as doing these mini-sodes. So I just wanted to get out there, talk about something topical. I didn't get to talk a lot in our last episode. Please check out our last episode with Cindy, who was, again, she's the Arizona GOP party secretary. We had a great show, talked about a lot of topical stuff. So I really encourage folks to take a look at that. And if you came in late, please check the replay of this particular broadcast if you want to get some information about Trump's latest executive order. And with that, as Pete would say, you keep flying free.